I'm a fifth-year senior majoring in political science with minors in Latino studies and women's studies. And I am Latina.
What are the facets of your identity?
So then I identify as Latina because the term Latina incorporates two very important parts of my identity that I really hold strong. So Latina, obviously, because Spanish is there's obviously gendered terms in Spanish. Latina is obviously for women. But then my ethnicity is mixed. So my mother's Colombian and my father's Mexican. So ever since I was little, it was difficult for me to identify with just one. So being able to say that I'm Latina helped incorporate both and give equal value to both of my parents' heritages. It wasn't until I got to college that I realized that the term Hispanic and Latina were actually very different. And I always thought they were interchangeable. But then I started learning more about the history of each term. And while the identifying as Latino is really, I don't want to say controversial, but different people who do have Latin descendancy or whatever identify different ways, but being that Hispanic only covers ancestry from Spain, I feel that it's not inclusive of all the history that is all over Latin America, so including the Native Americans, the indigenous, and the Africans that came over, that were brought over, I should say. So that's why I identify as Latina.
How do you feel your identity has shaped you being here at Penn State? Do you feel that you feel more comfortable with your identity? And have you ever felt like your identity wasn't as recognized here?
I've always been really comfortable identifying. And it was in college that I guess I would say I learned more about the history behind my heritage and my people and whatever. But I've for the second part of your question, like saying that if I ever had like trouble like identifying that here at Penn State specifically, I would say no. And I think it's because I have a really strong sense of my identity. Like, you're not gonna sit here and tell me that I'm not Latina, that I don't have, all these different races, all this mixed blood and things like that. So I've never seen it as something that's held me back, but rather something that's actually pushed me forward. And a lot of the things that I do it obviously not just for me, but like for my family and like the representation of people that do look like me. And I think I have overall I just think I have a really strong sense of identity.
How do you feel like being Latina fits into the concept of being a Penn Stater? Do you think it's something that meshes well with being a Penn Stater, or it's something that there's some disparities there?
I think being a Penn Stater is definitely involves being a couple of things, but there's something that I've always struggled with is being Latina and then also being like an academic scholar. So that doesn't mean that I have like a PhD or anything like that, but just being able to say that that when I speak in class, I have just as much validity as someone that isn't Latino or whatever like that. So it was in my feminist theory class that I started struggling with that. We called it like the oxymoron, that being a Latina scholar was almost like an oxymoron, because either I had to choose between being a Latina or choose between being a scholar, and I obviously don't want to do that. And I'm still trying to find ways to make it so that I don't justify my identity as a reason for why I can't, understand certain literature or certain articles or things like that, but rather have it be again, like a factor of why I need to keep pushing and things like that.
I never felt like, because I know sometimes, like you were saying, being Latina and being a scholar, sometimes you might end up feeling a bit undermined in the classroom. So do you ever feel like your being at the university, or even your identity, has ever been kind of invalidated, or I guess not seen as important? Do you ever feel like you don't have as much of a voice?
I would actually say the opposite. I think I have a very unique experience at Penn State in the sense that because of all the involvement that I've had over the last 5 years, and being that I've been fortunate enough to interact with so many different kinds of faculty, that when they need like a diverse person or whatever, I usually do get that email or things like that, and I don't take it as being a token, but rather I take it as they see that it's important for someone like me to be in the room. So have I seen instances of times where maybe people are insensitive to what they may say to me, or how they explain a situation to me, or explain their frustration? So again, I don't think I've ever felt invalidated, but rather I do think people have become comfortable enough with me to ask me maybe questions that might be deemed taboo or politically incorrect or things like that. I think I've had a really unique experience. Mm-hmm. I don't think it happens to a lot of people.
In terms of being at the university and perhaps being able to be a voice of not only just Latinos on campus, but also people of color, how do you feel that you've contributed to helping better Penn State's race relations, or do you think that Penn State has an issue with race relations?
Being a student of color is interesting at Penn State. I would say that for sure, because it is hard to try to find where you're going to fit in, obviously. And so I do think that Penn State has some trouble with being open about these discussions, I think Penn State has issues with just talking about other things in general, and this just happens to be one of them. Mm-hmm. So as for me personally, something that I've learned, I think in the past couple of years, especially having been like president of Latino Caucus and a director for MLK commemoration, is that those avenues are great places to start for student leaders of color, but I believe that at Penn State, at least, in order to make true change, we have to infiltrate the mainstream areas of involvement, whether it be for students or for faculty or for academia and things like that. So I would say that having been involved in homecoming, having been involved in Thon, having been involved with students engaging students, again, I'm able to say that I challenged myself and got out of my comfort zone with people that look like me, in order for these conversations to start, for people to start feeling comfortable enough to ask me questions, and to start difficult conversations.
When looking back at Penn State's history in terms of race relations and students of color being openly accepted and even being able to attend this university, how do you think Penn State has done with that? And what are some things, have you seen any changes? Do you feel like things are getting better, or do you feel like it's still something that is kind of like flown under the radar continuously?
Again, I think Penn State has difficulty with having those conversations about race relations, and I personally wasn't okay with how they dealt with the Kyle incident, like just putting them on probation. Like that for me wasn't enough. Or with the Hub is not a playground thing. okay, I understand that she may have not known and things like that. A lot of my, I guess, social justice training, I guess you can call it, came from the Paul Robeson Cultural Center and having conversations there. And something that I definitely, like, picked up and have become true to is that we're in college now. It's the 21st century. Like, there is no excuse for ignorance anymore. Between Twitter and between social media and the internet, which is insanely large, the fact that we can all connect like within seconds of each other with people that are miles and miles and miles apart. I truly do believe that ignorance is a choice that you make. And as much as people can say that, oh, I wasn't exposed to black people in my small town, or or living with an international student is hard because they're different, or just things along those lines. It's like, well, in order for change to happen, again, in order for anything to just shift, like, there has to be some type of uncomfortable situation happening, and we have to learn how to deal with it. Again, going back to Penn State, I don't know if Penn State's ready to deal with these things, to be quite honest with you. And at the same time, I don't know who we is, but like, if we're doing any better. But we've talked about this before, like with the Latino Studies department, how big of a mess it is. Like, who comes first? Do students request those Latino Studies classes and then have the university bring them in, or does the university bring in those faculty and then students will start applying to Penn State because they see that they have a strong Latino Studies department, things like that.
With We Are, there's a lot of history behind that chant. There's a lot of, I guess, camaraderie that happens when we say it, but when you think of We Are Penn State, who do you think the we is? And do you feel that you fall into that we, or are there some disparities there?
I think the we and We Are it really is, I want to believe that it is for anyone that identifies as a Penn Stater. If you are a Penn Stater, then I do believe that you belong in the We Are. Visually, in representation, maybe that does look really different, and it's not as inclusive, and again, that's something that we need to start looking at, because I don't even know if people understand where that We Are comes from. I don't know if people understand just even like the history of Penn State in general. You have like tons of people that don't really like know the alma mater, that don't really know like things about like Old Main, or like just things like that. So yeah, that's probably not, I don't know how many people would agree with me, but I want, like I said, I want to believe that anybody that identifies as a Penn Stater belongs under that We Are.
What are your feelings around the Penn State culture that we have, because it is such a strong part of the university? What are your feelings around that, and how do you feel that that intersects with your identity as a student of color?
The intersections are rough. I would say that. I would say that Penn State culture, either you get engulfed in it or you work really hard to not get engulfed in it. And it's so conflicting, because I do love this school, and if it wasn't for me coming to Penn State, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. Not in terms of like having a degree and things like that, but just like the things that I've learned. I would have never thought I would have been a women's studies major at one point. That like my background is in feminist theory. Like I probably wouldn't have had that had I gone to CUNY in New York, had I stayed at home, had I gone to a SUNY upstate. And so it is really rough to have that women's studies background and then live in such a bubble that is so it's pretty much like really against change. So I know that I deal with those things a lot, in terms of, getting people to think about language and how language can be oppressive. Think about just everyday things that we say, inclusivity, intersectionality, because you have to, something else that I learned is that you have to start with people with where they are. Like, you can't just force them to like become social justice activists like from one day to the next. Like, they have to start slowly, and then you can't get frustrated with them if they are trying to understand.
What do you feel like it's like to be a woman at Penn State? How do you feel that the identity of being a woman, being a female, plays out on Penn State's campus?
So I personally, when I do talk about like my identity as a woman, I talk about being a woman, because when people talk about when you describe me as just like a female, you're only identifying that I have a vagina. That's literally all that you're like talking about. So being a woman at Penn State, again, is also really hard, only because you see it from day one as a first year student here, with the way that women have to dress compared to men in order to go out, in order to go to class, in order to do, whatever. And then just like the different activities that you partake in. And I have no qualms saying that Penn State definitely has a very patriarchal foundation. The old, what is it called? The old boys club is definitely still very much alive. And yeah, Penn State is extremely real. Yeah, Penn State, I wouldn't say Penn State men don't like women in general. And I can hear that from my residents talking about one another. Like, I can hear that from the way that men put down women when it comes down to making executive decisions, and even just like looking at the structure of how things, of who's in that position. If you look at the structure of the university.
How do you feel ethnic studies are represented on campus?
It's really disappointing. It's really sad, being that the AAAS department divided, and that the Latino Studies department is not a real department, and that things keep getting fed like elsewhere. And again, it goes back to, I don't know who needs to make that demand. Is it the students, and why are the students not demanding those things? And then does the university even care about those things too? So I don't really like the whole U.S. cultural, international cultural, gen ed thing. I think it's too easy to like get out of a real conversation with those things. And I would like to see, even if it is just an ethnic studies department, being formulated, as long as it's strong. I think that's all that really matters, and that students of color are actively demanding it, and that we're standing in solidarity and asking for more professors of color, asking for more research money to be put into grant money, I should say, to be put into research that has to do with things like this. When I first came to campus, I was actually a volunteer at the LGBTA Center. I volunteered there for 2 years, because in my high school, my guidance counselor was the advisor for like the LGBT alliance back in high school, so I figured I would probably be comfortable in that area too. And so I did learn a lot of things, and being that I still get, working with LGBTA studies is really humbling, because it reminds me that as much as I try and learn about inclusivity and social justice, that there's always something new to be learned, and that you can always do a better job at being more inclusive, and not being ignorant. So that's kind of my my involvement with that. Unfortunately, I couldn't, like, not that I couldn't, but I started doing other things. So I started becoming more involved with, like, the Paul Robeson Cultural Center, with, like, student activities and things like that. But I always made sure that I still tried my best to be the best ally possible. So there's that. And then with privilege. So again, coming into college, I guess I don't know if I was fed this, but I had this understanding that I was Latina, I was a woman, I was 18, I didn't really have much to say, what I was doing wasn't really going to be heard, and it wasn't until I went to Cuba, between the summer between my sophomore and junior year, that I realized I actually do have more privilege than I ever would have thought. Being an American citizen and having an American passport is, if you travel and get out of the country, like, that's a huge deal. Speaking English is another thing that people internationally is just, like, well taken. Having an education, as much as I fought, like, so many of us getting to college is, I don't know if it's a struggle, but, like, it's kind of like that dream, and then actually having it, it's like, okay, I have this, so now what am I gonna do? How is it gonna work out? But just being college educated is definitely one of those privileges that not a lot of people get to do. So that was something that I discovered, again, also in college, and it's something that has stayed with me for a really long time. Again, it's one of those, like, humbling experiences that I think I try to look for. I try to look for that grounding.
If you were to give a piece of advice to your freshman self, now that you are getting ready to graduate, what would that be? What would that look like?
It's funny that you say that, because I was, this week, I was actually thinking about emailing all of the residents that I've ever had, and just giving them, like the top 3 or the top 5 things that I learned from Penn State. If I had to look at my freshman self and tell her something, one, I would say, stop procrastinating. Get, like, when I started college, I, like, from K to 12, I always thought, grades were the most important thing. But then once I finally got to college, I was like, oh, I made it. No, I haven't. Calm down. I would actually tell her to get out of liberal arts and go to DUS. That's what I would tell her first. And then 2, I would tell her that everything's going to work out. That all the people that need to be eliminated from your life will leave, and the people that are going to teach you stuff are going to stay. I am Andrea. I am Latina. I am a woman. I'm an ally. I'm a big sister. And I am Penn State.